Marcus Thompson wasn't just a reclusive 45-year-old bachelor who had been quietly farming. 160 acres of Nebraska corn for 8 years. He was Detective Marcus Antonio Delacroix, a former New Orleans Police Department organized crime investigator, who had been hiding his wife and 3 children in an elaborate underground safe house while living under federal witness protection after testifying against one of the most dangerous crime families in Louisiana history. The discovery would shatter the quiet farming community of Millbrook Valley, Nebraska, population 847, and expose a story of courage, sacrifice, and paternal devotion that redefined what it means to protect the people you love most while serving justice at the ultimate personal cost. Before we dive into this incredible story, tell us in the comments what you think you'd sacrifice to protect your family. And if stories about hidden heroes living among us fascinate you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow we've got an even more extraordinary tale of ordinary people doing the extraordinary. Marcus Thompson had materialized in Millbrook Valley on a blistering August morning in 2016, driving a dust-covered 2008 Ford F-150 that looked like it had hauled farm equipment across half the continent, pulling a livestock trailer containing exactly for Holstein dairy cows whose nervous lowing echoed across the empty fields, and carrying nothing more than a weathered canvas duffel bag, a red Craftsman toolbox that had clearly been through several lifetimes of use, and exactly $3,200 in cash, just enough to put a down payment on the abandoned Henley farm that had been sitting empty for 2 years after old Sam Henley died without heirs, and no one in the family wanted to take over a struggling agricultural operation in the middle of nowhere, Nebraska. For 8 years, he'd been the definition of a hard-working loner rising before 4:30 a.m. to tend his crops and livestock, working 16-hour days during planting and harvest seasons that pushed his endurance to limits that impressed even veteran farmers who had been working the same land for generations, and somehow managing to transform 160 acres of neglected farmland into one of the most productive and innovative corn operations in 3 counties, while barely speaking to another human being beyond the absolutely necessary transactions at the grain elevator, the farm supply store, in Peterson's general store, where he bought his groceries with the efficiency of someone who viewed human interaction as a necessary evil rather than a social pleasure. The property he'd purchased for $3,200 down had been deteriorating steadily since Sam Henley's death from a massive heart attack while checking irrigation lines on a scorching July afternoon in 2014. The farmhouse was a testament to rural bachelor living in gradual decline, a 2-story frame structure with a sagging front porch that threatened to collapse under the weight of accumulated junk, windows that hadn't been washed since the Clinton administration, and living quarters that Sam had maintained with the Spartan efficiency of a man who had never expected visitors, hadn't cared about comfort beyond basic survival needs, and had gradually let maintenance slide as arthritis made physical work increasingly difficult in his final years. The outbuildings told the story of a farm that had been slowly declining for the better part of 3 decades, a massive red barn with a roof that leaked catastrophically when the wind blew from the west, equipment sheds filled with rusted machinery that hadn't run since the Reagan administration and probably couldn't be repaired even if replacement parts still existed, grain storage bins that were more rust than metal and looked like they might collapse if anyone looked at them too hard, and a collection of smaller structures that served no identifiable purpose and appeared to be slowly sinking into the Nebraska soil. But the land itself was magnificent, 640 acres of rich black earth that could grow almost anything if properly managed, with natural drainage that prevented flooding, topsoil that was 18 inches deep in some places, and a location that provided ideal growing conditions for corn, soybeans, and wheat. The irrigation infrastructure was outdated but functional. The property had excellent access to rural roads that connected to major transportation networks. The isolation that had discouraged other potential buyers was exactly what Marcus had been looking for, though no one in Millbrook Valley could have guessed why complete privacy was worth more to him than convenience or community. Marcus had spent 3 hours walking every acre of the 160-acre spread that first morning, examining soil conditions with the intensity of someone who understood agriculture at a level that went far beyond casual farming knowledge, but also surveying sightlines, access routes, and defensive positions, with the methodical attention to detail that suggested training in threat assessment and tactical planning. He had evaluated the property not just as farmland, but as a secure location where someone could live in complete isolation while maintaining constant awareness of potential approaches by unwanted visitors. The people of Millbrook Valley had watched Marcus's arrival with the mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and cautious optimism that farming communities reserve for outsiders who appear to have even less money than the struggling local farmers who were barely managing to keep their operations profitable in an increasingly difficult agricultural economy. Millbrook Valley, Nebraska, wasn't the kind of place people moved to with dreams of success and prosperity. It was the kind of place that ambitious young farmers moved away from as quickly as they could arrange financing for land in more prosperous agricultural regions closer to major markets and better infrastructure. Located exactly 67 miles west of Lincoln, along a state highway that carried just enough traffic to keep the roads maintained, but not enough to bring economic development. The valley had been settled by German and Czech immigrants in the 1880s, who had been drawn by cheap land and the promise of agricultural prosperity. The community had thrived during the agricultural boom of the early 20th century, when crop prices were high and farming families were large enough to provide all the labor needed for successful operations. But it had been slowly losing population. Ever since mechanization reduced the number of people needed to work the same amount of farmland, and economic consolidation made small family farms increasingly difficult to operate profitably. The valley now supported maybe 36 farming families scattered across a 10-mile radius. Most of them third or fourth generation operations that had survived by adapting to changing conditions and finding ways to increase efficiency while more reducing costs. The community infrastructure reflected the area's declining population and economic challenges. A grain elevator that served a 50-mile radius and was the economic heart of the entire region, Peterson's General Store, that doubled as the post office and served as the unofficial social center where farmers gathered to discuss weather, crop prices, and local gossip. Miller's insurance agency that was only open 3 days a week because Ed Miller also worked as a crop adjuster for the county and spent the rest of his time driving hundreds of miles to assess hail damage and other agricultural disasters. A volunteer fire department that operated out of a converted school bus garage and depended on 12 volunteers, whose average age was pushing 60. Main Street consisted of exactly 4 buildings that told the story of rural economic decline through their varying states of occupancy and repair. Peterson's General Store, with its hand-painted sign and screen door that slammed with authority. Miller's insurance agency, with its faded awning and windows that were only lit 3 days a week. The grain elevator office that buzzed with activity during planting and harvest seasons, but sat empty for months at a time. And what had once been Hoffman's Cafe, but had been abandoned since 2009 when the State Highway Department rerouted traffic around the valley instead of through it, eliminating the occasional travelers who had provided just enough business to keep the restaurant marginally profitable. The nearest hospital was 43 miles away in Columbus. The nearest McDonald's was 51 miles in the opposite direction. And the nearest traffic light was so far away that most valley residents couldn't remember exactly where it was. Located and had to think for several seconds when visitors asked for directions to anything that resembled urban civilization. This isolation was exactly what had driven away most potential residents over the past 3 decades. But it was also exactly what had attracted Marcus Thompson to a place where a man could disappear completely while maintaining the appearance of living a normal, productive life. When Marcus Thompson bought the Henley farm and moved into the isolated farmhouse with his 4 dairy cows, his obvious determination to make a living from crops that had been neglected for 2 years, and his clearly limited financial resources, he became an instant source of speculation, concern, and guarded hope among neighbors, who understood farming well enough to recognize that his situation was either desperately ambitious or carefully planned for reasons they couldn't begin to imagine. Marcus's first months in Millbrook Valley were a masterclass in strategic, rural integration and carefully managed visibility that demonstrated an understanding of small-town dynamics that seemed almost supernatural in its precision and effectiveness. He understood that in a farming community where everyone knew everyone's business going back 3 generations, where gossip traveled faster than broadband internet, and where newcomers were evaluated according to criteria that had been refined, over more than a century of agricultural cooperation and competition, the key to hiding in plain sight was to become exactly interesting enough to satisfy curiosity without encouraging deeper investigation that might reveal uncomfortable truths about his background and motivations. He needed to be memorable enough that people would feel they understood his story and could explain his presence to anyone who asked questions, but unremarkable enough that no one would dig deeper into his background or spend too much time analyzing the details that didn't quite add up for anyone who was paying particularly close attention. Most importantly, he needed to demonstrate agricultural competence quickly enough to gain acceptance from neighbors, who would be watching carefully to determine whether he was a serious farmer who deserved their respect and assistance, or just another city person who had romanticized rural life without understanding the hard realities of making a living from the land. His approach was methodical, sophisticated, and brilliant in ways that reflected an understanding of human psychology and community dynamics that went far beyond what would be expected from someone whose claimed background was agricultural college. In 15 years of farming in Iowa, within 2 weeks of arriving, he had introduced himself to every farmer within a 10-mile radius, visiting each operation with a combination of humility and confidence that immediately established him as someone who understood farming protocols and respected the informal, a hierarchy that governed relationships in agricultural communities. His story was heartbreaking enough to generate sympathy while being specific enough to feel authentic and painful, enough to discourage the kind of follow-up questions that might lead to uncomfortable revelations about his real background and the circumstances that had brought him to Nebraska. According to Marcus's carefully constructed narrative, he was a recently divorced agriculture college graduate who had lost his wife, his children, and most of his assets in a bitter custody battle that had destroyed not just his marriage, but his entire life in Iowa, leaving him with nothing but his farming knowledge and a determination to rebuild his life, somewhere far enough away that he wouldn't be constantly reminded of everything he had lost. He explained that his ex-wife had been the daughter of a successful Iowa farming family, and that their divorce had been so acrimonious that she had been awarded full custody of their 3 children along with the family farm that had been his home and livelihood for 15 years. The legal fees had consumed his savings. The emotional trauma had destroyed his relationships with former friends and neighbors who had been forced to choose sides in the bitter conflict, and his only option had been to start over somewhere completely new where he could focus on farming without the emotional complications of his failed marriage and lost family. Marcus chose to present himself as someone from Iowa because he understood that Nebraska farmers would find it completely believable that someone might move from one corn farming state to another, especially if they were trying to escape personal problems and rebuild their lives in a place where no one knew their history. The distance between Iowa and Nebraska was sufficient to make casual verification virtually impossible, while the cultural similarities meant that his knowledge of farming practices and agricultural equipment would seem authentic to people who shared the same basic approaches to growing crops and managing livestock. He spoke with the slight Midwestern accent that was common throughout the region, dropping the occasional reference to Iowa farming practices, equipment dealers, and crop varieties that he could have learned from any agricultural magazine or farming website, but that sounded authentic to people who had never farmed outside Nebraska, weren't familiar with the specific details of agricultural operations in neighboring states. His knowledge was comprehensive enough to be convincing, but not so specialized as to raise questions about where someone with his claimed background would have acquired such detailed expertise. Marcus's first priority was establishing his competence as a farmer, which required demonstrating agricultural knowledge that was impressive enough to gain acceptance from experienced neighbors while not being so sophisticated as to raise questions about where he had acquired such expertise or why someone with his apparent capabilities was starting over with such limited resources. He claimed to have studied agriculture at Iowa State University, which was prestigious enough to explain his theoretical knowledge while being common, enough that his education wouldn't seem unusual or particularly noteworthy to neighbors who understood that agricultural colleges graduated hundreds of students every year. According to his story, he had worked on his ex-wife's family farm for 15 years after college, gradually taking over management responsibilities as his father-in-law aged and his own expertise developed, till the divorce forced him to start over with nothing but his farming knowledge and determination to succeed on his own terms. This background explained his obvious competence, while also justifying his emotional reluctance to discuss his personal history and his apparent bitterness about family relationships that had ended in betrayal and loss. The first crop Marcus planted in Millbrook Valley was 160 acres of corn, using techniques that impressed his neighbors with their efficiency, innovation, and obvious expertise in modern agricultural methods. He had somehow managed to lease modern planting equipment that most valley farmers couldn't afford, including GPS-guided tractors and precision planting systems that could optimize seed placement and fertilizer application in ways that maximized yield while minimizing costs. His approach to soil preparation, seed selection, and nutrient management demonstrated a level of sophistication that seemed almost too advanced for someone who was supposedly starting over after losing everything. In a divorce settlement, word spread quickly through Millbrook Valley's informal agricultural network, which operated through a combination of coffee shop conversations, grain elevator discussions, and informal visits between neighbors who were always curious about new techniques and different approaches to common farming challenges. Ed Miller mentioned Marcus's innovative farming methods to Pete Peterson at the general store, who passed the information along to Jim Kowalski at the grain elevator, who shared the details with his brother-in-law, who farmed near the county line, and was always looking for ways to improve his own operations' efficiency and profitability. Within a month, Marcus had a steady stream of neighbors who would stop by to observe his techniques, ask questions about his approach to modern farming, and evaluate whether his methods might be applicable to their own operations. These visits served multiple purposes for Marcus. They established his credibility as a serious farmer who deserved acceptance and respect from the agricultural community. They provided opportunities to gather information about local farming, practices, and community dynamics. And they allowed him to demonstrate the kind of openness and cooperation that would discourage suspicion about his background or motivations. Marcus's approach to neighbor relations was carefully calculated to build trust and acceptance while maintaining appropriate boundaries that would protect his operational security without seeming antisocial or deliberately secretive. He was friendly, but not overly social, demonstrating the kind of reserved friendliness that was common among farmers who were too busy with their own operations to spend excessive time on social activities. He was knowledgeable about agricultural techniques and willing to share information, but he avoided discussions of personal topics and never volunteered details about his background beyond the basic story he had established about his divorce and fresh start in Nebraska. He would discuss farming techniques, weather patterns, and crop prices for hours with anyone who was interested, demonstrating expertise that impressed neighbors while also gathering valuable intelligence about local conditions, agricultural practices, and community relationships that might be relevant to his security situation. But he would skillfully redirect conversations away from personal topics whenever neighbors asked questions about his family, his previous life in Iowa, or his long-term plans for his Nebraska operation. Most importantly, Marcus demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to anticipate agricultural problems and adapt to changing conditions in ways that seemed to exceed what would be expected from even the most experienced farmers in the region. His weather prediction skills were extraordinary, allowing him to time planting and harvesting, activities with precision that consistently resulted in better yields and lower losses than his neighbors achieved. His understanding of crop diseases and pest management was encyclopedic. It's enabling him to identify and address problems before they became serious enough to affect productivity. His ability to maximize efficiency using limited resources bordered on miraculous, achieving results that seemed impossible given his claimed financial constraints and lack of established relationships with suppliers and equipment dealers. Neighboring farmers began consulting Marcus about problems they couldn't solve, bringing him samples of diseased plants, asking for advice about equipment failures, and seeking his opinions about marketing strategies and crop selection decisions. Marcus would methodically work through complex agricultural challenges using knowledge and analytical methods that seemed to come from sources beyond typical farming experience, providing solutions that consistently proved effective while never fully explaining how he had developed such sophisticated problem-solving capabilities. While Marcus was establishing his agricultural reputation and building relationships with neighbors who could provide both social acceptance and operational security through their unwitting cooperation, he was simultaneously creating a living, a situation that would allow him to maintain the operational security required by his real circumstances while providing his family with safety, comfort, and as much normalcy as possible under conditions that were anything but normal. This balancing act required extraordinary skill, constant vigilance, and emotional strength that was tested every day by the contradictions between his public identity as a lonely bachelor farmer and his private reality as a devoted husband and father who was risking everything to protect the people he loved most. The farmhouse that Marcus had purchased had been Sam Henley's bachelor retreat for over 30. It's a combination of functional living space and agricultural workspace that reflected the practical priorities of a man who had valued utility over comfort and had gradually let maintenance slide as age made physical work increasingly difficult. The building had all the charm of a poorly maintained hunting cabin, with rooms that felt more like storage areas than living spaces. A kitchen that had been designed for feeding one person as efficiently as possible, and bathrooms that reflected an era when indoor plumbing was still considered a luxury rather than a necessity. Marcus spent his first month in Millbrook Valley transforming the building into something that could provide comfortable, secure living for a family of 5, while maintaining the external appearance of a solitary farmer's Spartan lifestyle that wouldn't attract attention or generate questions from neighbors who might notice improvements that seemed inconsistent with his claimed financial situation. He installed new insulation and heating systems to make the house suitable for year-round family occupation. But he made sure that all improvements were hidden inside the walls where neighbors wouldn't notice changes that might suggest the house was accommodating more people than one bachelor farmer who was supposedly trying to rebuild his life on a minimal budget. He updated the electrical and plumbing systems to handle the demands of a family with 3 children who needed consistent power for computers, educational equipment, and the modern conveniences that would make their underground existence bearable. But he routed all new installations through existing access points to avoid creating visible evidence of expanded occupancy that might be noticed by visitors or neighbors who had known the property during Sam Henley's ownership. He reinforced the building's structure to support additional weight and stress, but he concealed all structural improvements within routine maintenance and repair work that would seem normal for someone trying to restore a neglected property to functional condition. But beneath this carefully constructed agricultural lifestyle, Marcus was installing some of the most sophisticated security and communication equipment available to federal witness protection operations, creating a defensive and monitoring system that could detect threats from miles away while maintaining the appearance of routine. Farm security measures that wouldn't seem unusual to neighbors who understood the importance of protecting valuable agricultural equipment and livestock from theft and vandalism. Hidden within the barn walls were motion sensors and surveillance cameras that could monitor approaches from any direction, providing comprehensive coverage of all routes that could be used to reach the farmhouse while appearing to be nothing more than standard farm security equipment designed to prevent equipment theft and livestock rustling. Concealed in the grain storage bins were communication systems that maintained encrypted contact with federal marshals and provided emergency notification capabilities that could summon help within minutes of detecting unauthorized intrusion or any other threat that might require immediate law enforcement response. The storm cellar that every Nebraska farm required for tornado protection had been converted into far more than a weather shelter or root cellar for preserving food through the winter months. What appeared to be a standard underground storage area for storing canned goods and providing emergency refuge during severe weather actually contained living quarters, communication equipment, supply storage, and defensive positions that could support a family of 5 for months if circumstances required. Extended isolation from the outside world, or if their location was discovered by the criminal organization that had sworn to kill Marcus and his family in retaliation for his testimony. But his afternoon activities were far more complex than anyone realized, involving coordination with family members who remained hidden in the underground facility during daylight hours when the risk of discovery was highest, maintenance of security, and communication equipment that required technical expertise far beyond what would be expected from a typical farmer, in preparation for emergency scenarios that might require immediate evacuation or defensive action to protect his family from threats that could materialize without warning. Evenings were family time, but family time that occurred in an underground bunker where his wife Sarah and their 3 children, Michael, 12, and little Sophie, 8, could move freely, speak in normal voices, and live as normally as possible under circumstances that were anything but normal for a family that had been forced into hiding through no fault of their own, except their father's decision to choose justice over personal safety when he was given the opportunity to help bring down one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in the United States. Marcus would help with homework assignments that had to be completed without access to traditional schools or teachers, read bedtime stories that provided comfort and normalcy in an environment that was designed for survival rather than childhood development, and provide the emotional connection and parental guidance that his children needed while ensuring that their presence remained completely invisible to neighbors who had no idea that the lonely bachelor farmer was actually a devoted family man who was living every day with the knowledge that discovery could result in the death of everyone he loved most. The children had adapted to their underground lifestyle with the remarkable resilience that children sometimes display. When they understand that their safety depends on following rules they're too young to fully comprehend, but old enough to recognize as absolutely necessary for their survival. They knew their father had been a police officer who had helped put bad people in jail. They understood that those bad people might try to hurt their family if they ever discovered where they were hiding. But they also knew that their father had built them a safe place where they could be together as a family, even if they couldn't go outside during the day, attend regular school like other children, or have friends who could visit and play. Sarah Delacroix had been a middle school teacher in New Orleans, before their lives were completely destroyed by Marcus's decision to testify against the Fontaine crime family, a choice that had seemed like the right thing to do until they learned that the organization's reach extended far beyond Louisiana and that their commitment to revenge was absolute and permanent. She had adapted to their underground existence by creating a comprehensive homeschool curriculum that ensured Emma, Michael, and Sophie continued their education despite their isolation, developing lesson plans that covered all subjects and grade levels, while also providing the emotional support and intellectual stimulation that growing children needed to develop normally despite their extraordinary circumstances. The underground facility included a classroom area with computers, educational materials, science equipment, art supplies, and even musical instruments that allowed the children to continue learning at grade level or above, while also pursuing interests and talents that might have been neglected in traditional school settings. Sarah had become a master of creative teaching methods that made learning engaging and fun despite the limitations of their environment, finding ways to provide hands-on experiences, group activities, and individual attention that helped each child develop their unique abilities and interests. But the emotional toll of this lifestyle was enormous for all of them, requiring constant strength and determination to maintain hope and family bonds under conditions that tested their resilience. Every day, Sarah struggled with the isolation and the constant fear that their location might be discovered, knowing that Marcus's testimony had made them permanent targets of people who had unlimited resources and absolutely no moral constraints about killing entire families to send messages about the consequences of cooperating with law enforcement. The children missed their friends, their school activities, their extended family members, and the simple freedom of playing outside whenever they wanted, riding bicycles, going to movies, or participating in any of the normal childhood activities that most children took for granted. They had been forced to give up everything that had made their lives normal and happy, trading security for freedom and safety for the chance to grow up with both parents alive and together. Marcus carried the heaviest emotional burden of all, knowing that his decision to testify against the crime family had forced his entire family into a life of hiding that might never end. that his children were growing up in an underground bunker, because he had chosen to do what he believed was right rather than what would have been safe for the people he loved most. Every day brought the possibility that their location might be discovered, that years of careful planning and operational security might be defeated by a single mistake or piece of bad luck that could result in the death of his wife and children. Yet Marcus found strength in knowing that his testimony had helped convict members of a criminal organization that had been responsible for dozens of murders, large-scale drug trafficking, political corruption, and violence that had devastated communities throughout Louisiana and beyond. The Fontaine family had operated with impunity for decades, corrupting police officers, intimidating witnesses, and eliminating anyone who threatened their operations through methods that included torture, assassination, and the murder of family. Members who had nothing to do with law enforcement, but who could be killed to send messages about the consequences of cooperation with authorities. Every day of safety he could provide for his family. Every month that passed without discovery. Every year that allowed his children to grow and develop in an environment where they were loved and protected was a victory that validated his decision. To choose justice over personal security and public service over family safety, his testimony had helped remove dangerous criminals from the streets, protected other families from becoming victims, and demonstrated that even the most powerful criminal organizations could be defeated. When police officers were willing to risk everything to uphold the law and protect innocent people, as Marcus worked his fields each day, maintaining the fiction that he was a lonely bachelor farmer, trying to rebuild his life after a difficult divorce, he was actually living the most important role of his life, not as Detective Delacroix, the decorated police officer who had taken down organized crime at the cost of his own safety and freedom, but as a father who had sacrificed everything to keep his children alive, and a husband who was determined to preserve his family, even if it meant spending years pretending they didn't exist, while living every day with the knowledge that discovery could mean death for everyone he loved most in the world. To understand the earthquake that Marcus Thompson's revelation would cause in Millbrook Valley, you need to understand what kind of community this was in 2024, and more importantly, who the residents believed Marcus to be during his 8 years among them. Millbrook Valley, Nebraska, wasn't just any declining agricultural community. It was a place where people knew each other's stories going back for generations, where gossip traveled faster than the morning milk truck, and where a divorced farmer, working 160 acres alone while rebuilding his life, had become a symbol of quiet determination that the entire community had come to respect and protect. The valley stretched between gentle hills that had once been covered with family farmsteads, but were now mostly empty fields growing back to prairie grass, dotted with abandoned homesteads whose crumbling foundations told the story of dreams that had withered along with the family farms that couldn't compete with industrial agriculture. State Highway 34 ran north-south through the valley's center, carrying a steady stream of grain trucks during harvest season and the occasional lost traveler who had missed the interstate exit. But most of that traffic moved through Millbrook Valley without stopping, seeing only the grain elevator, Peterson's general store, and the handful of farmsteads that represented what remained of a community that had once supported over 200 families. The valley sat in a geographical pocket that provided excellent growing conditions, rich soil deposited by ancient glaciers, natural drainage that prevented flooding, and a microclimate that typically provided just enough rainfall to support corn and soybeans without requiring expensive irrigation systems. But the same isolation that protected the valley from urban development also limited economic opportunities, making it increasingly difficult for young people to build lives that could support families and long-term prosperity. 3 blocks of buildings that told the story of rural economic consolidation through their varying states of occupancy and maintenance. Peterson's general store anchored the business district with its weathered wooden facade, hand-painted signs advertising everything from farm supplies to hunting licenses, and a front porch where farmers gathered to discuss weather, crop prices, and local gossip during the slow afternoon hours between morning chores and evening feeding schedules. The store served as much more than a retail establishment. It was the unofficial community center where residents exchanged information, coordinated mutual assistance, and maintained the social connections that held the scattered farming community together. Pete Peterson, now 67 years old and the third generation of his family to run the store, knew every customer's credit history, family situation, farming operation well enough to provide both business advice and personal counseling when circumstances required either or both. Miller's insurance agency occupied the second building on Main Street, operating out of a converted house where Ed Miller provided crop insurance, vehicle coverage, and property protection for farmers throughout a 50-mile radius. Ed worked part-time as a crop adjuster for the county, spending harvest season driving hundreds of miles to assess hail damage, drought losses, and other agricultural disasters that could bankrupt family operations that had been profitable for generations until weather or market conditions changed faster than farmers could adapt their operations. The grain elevator dominated the eastern end of Main Street, its concrete silos. Visible from 10 miles away and serving as a landmark that guided travelers through a landscape where most roads weren't marked, and GPS systems often provided directions that led to abandoned farmsteads or dead-end sections roads. The elevator was owned by a regional agricultural cooperative and managed by Jim Kowalski. His family had been farming in the valley since the 1890s and who understood crop marketing, transportation, logistics, and agricultural financing. Well, enough to serve as an informal advisor for farmers who needed guidance. It's about everything from seed selection to commodity futures trading. What had once been Hoffman's Cafe sat empty at the western end of Main Street, its windows covered with plywood, and its parking lot gradually being reclaimed by weeds that nobody bothered to cut because there was no longer any reason for travelers to stop in Millbrook Valley unless they were lost or experiencing mechanical problems that required assistance from neighbors, who were always willing to help but weren't necessarily equipped to handle major automotive repairs or provide overnight accommodations. The community's institutional infrastructure reflected both its agricultural heritage and its shrinking population. The volunteer fire department operated out of a converted school bus garage, staffed by 14 volunteers whose average age was approaching 60 and who covered a response area that required driving up to 20 miles to reach some of the more isolated farmsteads. The fire department also served as the community's emergency coordination center, maintaining radio communication with county law enforcement and providing the organizational structure that coordinated responses to everything, from house fires to agricultural accidents to severe weather emergencies. Millbrook Valley Elementary School had been consolidated with the county school system in 2003, meaning that the handful of school-aged children in the community were bused 37 miles each way to attend classes in Fairfield, spending over 2 hours daily in transportation that limited their participation in after-school activities and made it difficult for parents to maintain involvement in their children's education. The old school building now served as a community center for events like church services, town meetings, and the annual Harvest Festival that brought together families from throughout the region. The nearest hospital was 51 miles away in Columbus, creating challenges for residents who needed medical care and making it essential for community members to maintain basic first aid skills and emergency response capabilities that could provide critical assistance until professional medical help could arrive. Dr. Amanda Fisher, a family practice physician who had grown up on a farm near the valley, maintained a part-time clinic in the basement of Peterson's general store, providing routine medical care and emergency treatment 2 days a week while operating her primary practice in a larger town 40 miles to the east. This was the world that Marcus Thompson had entered in 2016. It was a world that had embraced his story of divorce, its financial loss, and determination to rebuild his life through honest agricultural work with the kind of fierce loyalty that rural communities reserve for people who choose to stay and fight rather than give up and leave when circumstances become difficult. Marcus's integration into Millbrook Valley's social fabric had been a carefully orchestrated process that required him to become visible enough to be accepted as a community member while maintaining enough privacy to protect his operational security and his family's safety. He understood that in a farming community where isolation could be dangerous and mutual assistance was essential for survival, Complete social withdrawal would be more suspicious than controlled interaction, so he systematically built relationships that would satisfy local expectations while reinforcing his cover identity as a divorced farmer. Trying to rebuild his life through agricultural success, his first and most important relationship was with Pete Peterson, whose general store served as the valley's informal information exchange and social coordination center. Pete had initially been skeptical of Marcus, wondering what kind of man would choose to move to a dying agricultural community with limited resources and no apparent connections to the area. But Marcus's respectful attitude, obvious agricultural knowledge, and genuine appreciation for Pete's experience and advice had gradually won the older man's trust and support. Marcus made a point of shopping at Peterson's general store whenever possible, even when he could have purchased supplies more cheaply in larger towns, understanding that supporting local businesses was expected behavior for community members who wanted to be accepted as neighbors rather than outsiders who were simply using the area for their own purposes. He would ask Pete's advice about local suppliers, farming practices, and community customs, treating the older man as a valuable source of information, while gradually sharing carefully selected details about his own background and challenges. This relationship served multiple purposes beyond simple community integration. Pete Peterson had lived in Millbrook Valley for 67 years and understood the area's history, family relationships, and informal power structures well enough to provide Marcus with intelligence about local personalities and potential security concerns. Pete knew which residents could be trusted with confidential information, which ones were incorrigible gossips who might inadvertently compromise operational security, and which ones had connections to law enforcement or government agencies that might pose risks if they became too curious about Marcus's background or activities. Pete's store also provided Marcus with a legitimate reason to regularly visit the community's social center, allowing him to monitor local conversations and gather information about any unusual activities or visitors that might represent security threats. The store's location at the intersection of the valley's two main roads provided excellent visibility for observing traffic patterns and identifying vehicles or individuals who didn't belong in the area, while Pete's extensive knowledge of regional residents made it possible to quickly identify strangers who might be conducting surveillance or gathering information about Marcus's operation. Marcus's relationship with Jim Kowalski at the grain elevator developed more slowly but became equally important for his integration into the agricultural community and his operational security. Jim had been farming in the valley for over 30 years and had seen dozens of newcomers arrive with ambitious plans and limited resources, most of whom had failed within a few seasons because they underestimated the challenges of making a living from agriculture in an increasingly competitive market environment. Jim's initial skepticism about Marcus's chances for success had been gradually replaced by respect for his agricultural expertise and admiration for his work ethic. But more importantly, Jim had come to appreciate Marcus's respectful treatment of other farmers and his willingness to share knowledge and assistance when neighbors faced problems or needed advice. Marcus had helped Jim troubleshoot equipment problems, provided guidance about crop rotation strategies, and shared information about market trends and commodity pricing that had helped improve the profitability of several local farming operations. The relationship with Jim Kowalski provided Marcus with several strategic advantages that were essential for maintaining his cover identity and operational security. The grain elevator served as the economic center of the agricultural community, handling crop sales and transportation for dozens of farming operations throughout the region, and Jim's position gave him access to information about agricultural activities, transportation schedules, and economic conditions that could be relevant to Marcus's security situation. More importantly, Jim's acceptance and endorsement carried significant weight within the farming community, helping to establish Marcus's credibility and reputation among neighbors, who might otherwise have remained suspicious of his background or motivations. When Jim Kowalski vouched for someone's character and agricultural competence, other farmers in the community generally accepted that assessment without requiring additional verification or investigation. Ed Miller, who ran the insurance agency and worked part-time as a crop adjuster, represented Marcus's most strategically important relationship within the community because of his connections to county law enforcement and government agencies. that could pose security risks if they became interested in Marcus's background or activities. Ed had served as a volunteer sheriff's deputy for over 20 years and maintained close relationships with county law enforcement officials. It might eventually become involved in investigating Marcus's operation if it was ever discovered, or if his real identity was somehow exposed. Marcus had cultivated his relationship with Ed Miller carefully, presenting himself as someone who understood the importance of proper insurance coverage and legal compliance, while also demonstrating the kind of respect for law enforcement that would discourage suspicion about his background or motivations. He had purchased comprehensive crop insurance through Ed's agency, maintained current vehicle registrations and licenses, and consistently followed all applicable agricultural regulations and environmental requirements. Most importantly, Marcus had demonstrated the kind of situational awareness and community responsibility that suggested someone who understood the importance of maintaining good relationships with local authorities and supporting law enforcement efforts to maintain safety and security throughout the region. He reported suspicious activities when appropriate, cooperated fully when county officials needed to inspect his operation for regulatory compliance, and volunteered to assist with community emergency response activities that required additional manpower or specialized skills. Dr. Amanda Fisher provided part-time medical services through a basement clinic at Peterson's General Store, represented both an opportunity and a potential security risk for Marcus's operation. Her medical training made her more observant than most community members about inconsistencies in personal histories or behaviors that might suggest hidden health problems or psychological stress, but her commitment to patient confidentiality and her understanding of domestic violence and family trauma made her potentially sympathetic to someone who appeared to be recovering from a difficult divorce and personal losses. Marcus had established a professional relationship with Dr. Fisher by scheduling routine health checkups and presenting himself as someone who understood the importance of preventive medical care, especially for someone who was working alone and couldn't afford to be incapacitated by health problems that could have been prevented or treated early. He had shared enough information about his claimed divorce and emotional trauma to explain any stress-related symptoms or behavioral patterns that might be observed, while being careful not to provide details that could be verified or that might raise questions about inconsistencies in his story. Dr. Fisher had become an important source of information about community health and welfare issues that could be relevant to Marcus's security situation, including domestic violence situations, substance abuse problems, and family conflicts that might create instability or unpredictable behavior among local residents. Her medical training and community connections also made her a valuable resource for emergency medical assistance if Marcus or his family members ever required treatment that couldn't be provided through normal healthcare channels. Miller's Farm, as the operation had come to be known throughout the region, had become one of Millbrook Valley's rare agricultural success stories. During an era when most family farming operations were struggling to remain profitable in an increasingly competitive and consolidated industry, Marcus's transformation of 160 acres of neglected farmland to a model of efficiency and productivity had attracted attention from agricultural extension agents, equipment dealers, and farming publications throughout Nebraska, establishing him as an example of what could be accomplished through innovation, hard work, and intelligent application of modern farming techniques. His first year's corn crop had yielded 187 bushels per acre, which was considered excellent for the area and represented a significant improvement over the 140 bushel average that Sam Henley had achieved during his final years of farming. More impressive than the total yield was Marcus's efficiency in achieving those results using equipment and inputs that cost significantly less than what most farmers in the region were spending to produce lower yields on similar soils and under comparable weather conditions. Marcus had achieved this success through a combination of precision agriculture techniques, soil management strategies, and equipment modifications that demonstrated an understanding of agricultural science that seemed to exceed what would be expected from someone with his claimed background. He used GPS-guided tractors to optimize planting patterns and fertilizer application, employed variable-rate seeding techniques that adjusted planting density based on soil conditions and topography, and implemented integrated pest management strategies that minimized chemical inputs while maintaining effective control of weeds, insects, and diseases. His approach to soil health management was particularly sophisticated, involving detailed soil testing, customized fertilizer programs, and crop rotation strategies that improve soil structure and nutrient availability. While reducing erosion and environmental impacts, he had established cover crop programs that protected soil during winter months and provided additional organic matter to improve water retention and nutrient cycling. Techniques that were being promoted by agricultural extension services, but were not yet widely adopted by farmers in the region. Marcus's equipment, maintenance, and modification capabilities were another source of community amazement and respect. He could diagnose and repair complex mechanical problems that local dealers couldn't solve, fabricate replacement parts for obsolete equipment using basic machine shop tools, and modify standard agricultural implements to improve their efficiency and effectiveness for specific field conditions and farming applications. His machine shop, located in the renovated barn, contained tools and equipment that seemed more sophisticated than what would typically be found on a family farm, including precision measuring instruments, welding equipment, and computerized diagnostic systems that allowed him to maintain and repair modern agricultural machinery without relying on dealer service departments that were often expensive and slow to respond during critical farming seasons. The shop's capabilities had made Marcus a valuable resource for neighboring farmers who needed emergency repairs or equipment modifications. And his willingness to provide assistance at reasonable costs had helped establish his reputation as a generous neighbor who understood the importance of mutual support within the agricultural community. He had helped repair Jim Kowalski's combine harvester during a critical period of wheat harvest, fabricated replacement parts for Pete Peterson's hay baler, and modified Ed Miller's spray equipment to improve its efficiency and reduce chemical waste. Marcus's financial management of his farming operation was equally impressive, demonstrating an understanding of agricultural economics and commodity marketing that enabled him to consistently achieve better prices for his crops while maintaining lower production costs than most farms in the region. He used forward contracting strategies to lock in favorable prices before harvest, employed storage and transportation techniques that minimized handling costs and quality losses, and maintained detailed financial records that allowed him to track profitability and identify opportunities for improvement. His success had attracted attention from agricultural lenders who were interested in providing financing for expansion, equipment dealers who wanted to establish relationships with a successful and growing operation, and even agricultural corporations who were looking for contract growers or potential acquisition targets. Marcus had politely declined most of these opportunities, explaining that he was focused on gradually building his operation to a sustainable size rather than pursuing rapid expansion that might compromise his financial stability or operational control. The farming community's respect for Marcus's agricultural achievements was reflected in the numerous invitations he received to speak at farmer meetings, participate in agricultural demonstration projects, and serve on committees that coordinated regional farming activities and advocacy efforts. He had been elected to the board of directors of the local agricultural cooperative, appointed to serve on the county soil conservation committee, and invited to participate in state-level discussions about agricultural policy and environmental regulations. These positions provided Marcus with valuable intelligence about agricultural activities throughout the region, including information about land transactions, farming operations, and business relationships that could be relevant to his security situation. They also helped establish his credibility and reputation within the broader agricultural community, making it less likely that his background would be questioned or investigated by people who might have connections to law enforcement or government agencies. Over his 8 years in Millbrook Valley, Marcus had become more than just a successful farmer. He had become a symbol of resilience and determination that the entire community had embraced and protected with the fierce loyalty that rural communities reserve for people who choose to stay and fight when circumstances become difficult. In a region where most news was bad news about farm foreclosures, business closures, and young people leaving for opportunities in larger cities, Marcus's story represented hope and the possibility that hard work and determination could still create success despite challenging economic conditions. The community's protective attitude toward Marcus was evident in dozens of small ways that reflected the informal support networks that farming communities create for people they consider part of their extended family. When Marcus's tractor had broken down during a critical period of spring planting, 3 different neighbors had offered to loan him equipment until repairs could be completed. Understanding that timing was essential for successful crop establishment, and that delays could result in significant yield losses that would threaten the financial viability of his operation. When a late spring snowstorm had damaged his machine shop roof, volunteer work crews had appeared without being asked, bringing materials and labor to complete repairs that would have been expensive and time-consuming if Marcus had been forced to hire professional contractors. The volunteers had included farmers who were busy with their own spring field work, but who understood that community members helped each other during emergencies, regardless of personal convenience or competing priorities. Local business owners had developed informal arrangements to support Marcus's success and help him manage the challenges of operating a farming business while maintaining the careful financial management that was essential for long-term sustainability. Pete Peterson would accept deliveries for Marcus's operation when he was busy with fieldwork. Jim Kowalski provided flexible payment schedules for grain storage and transportation services during periods when cash flow was tight. And Ed Miller had arranged insurance coverage that provided comprehensive protection at rates that reflected Marcus's excellent safety record and responsible management practices. The community's support extended to protective measures that reflected their understanding of Marcus's vulnerability as a divorced man who was still recovering from personal losses and who might be subject to continued harassment or legal problems related to his failed marriage and custody disputes. When strangers asked questions about Marcus's operation or background, community members would provide polite but limited information, protecting his privacy while redirecting conversations toward topics that didn't involve personal details or sensitive information. Dr. Fisher had been particularly protective of Marcus's medical privacy, understanding that divorce-related stress and family trauma could create health problems that required confidential treatment, and that public discussion of personal medical issues could compromise his emotional recovery and social integration within the community. She had provided counseling and stress management assistance while maintaining complete confidentiality about his treatment and avoiding any discussions that might reveal details about his psychological condition or personal history. Chief Deputy Robert Walsh of the Millbrook County Sheriff's Office had become an unofficial advocate for Marcus within the law enforcement community, recognizing him as a responsible citizen who contributed positively to community safety and security while maintaining respectful relationships with local authorities. Walsh had been impressed by Marcus's situational awareness, his willingness to report suspicious activities, and his cooperative attitude during the few occasions when law enforcement officials needed to visit his property for routine inspections or investigations of regional security concerns. What Chief Walsh didn't realize was that Marcus's cooperation and helpfulness reflected training in law enforcement procedures and understanding of investigative techniques that came from his background as a police detective, rather than simply the natural caution of a citizen who understood the importance of maintaining good relationships with local authorities. Marcus's ability to provide detailed and accurate information about suspicious activities, his understanding of evidence preservation procedures, and his knowledge of legal requirements related to search and seizure reflected professional experience that was inconsistent with his claimed background as a divorced farmer from Iowa. The community's protection of Marcus had been tested during his 3rd year in Millbrook Valley when a private investigator claiming to represent his ex-wife's attorney had appeared in the valley asking questions about Marcus's financial situation, property ownership, and business activities. The investigator had presented documentation suggesting that Marcus owed child support payments and that his ex-wife was attempting to locate assets that could be used to satisfy financial obligations related to their divorce settlement. The incident had lasted less than 2 days, but it had mobilized the entire community's protective instincts and demonstrated the lengths to which Millbrook Valley residents would go to defend someone they considered family. Pete Peterson had politely declined to provide information about Marcus's business activities. Jim Kowalski had refused to discuss grain sales or financial transactions. Ed Miller had cited confidentiality requirements related to insurance coverage and refused to confirm or deny details about Marcus's property ownership or risk assessment. Most importantly, Chief Deputy Walsh had conducted a thorough background check on the private investigator and discovered that his credentials were fraudulent and that he was actually a convicted criminal who had been hired by unknown parties. To gather information about Marcus's operation and financial situation, the investigator was arrested on charges related to fraudulent impersonation of a licensed private detective, was found to be carrying surveillance equipment and weapons that suggested his intentions. Went far beyond routine civil investigation. What the community never learned was that the incident had been a probe by the Fontaine crime family's intelligence network, testing Marcus's security situation and evaluating the community's response to outside investigation of his background and activities. The fake private investigator had been gathering information that could be used to plan a more serious assault on Marcus's operation. But the community's protective response and law enforcement's quick identification of the threat had forced the criminal organization to abort their reconnaissance mission and develop alternative approaches to locating and eliminating their target. The success of this test had demonstrated to Marcus's federal protection handlers that his integration into the Millbrook Valley community was providing genuine security benefits beyond simple camouflage, creating a protective network of people who would actively defend him against threats while never understanding the true nature of the dangers he faced, or the real reasons why their protection was essential for his family's survival. Marcus's daily routine, as perceived by the community, had become as predictable and reassuring as the sunrise, providing neighbors with a sense of stability and continuity that was particularly valued in a region where economic uncertainty and demographic decline created constant anxiety about the future. His visible activities followed patterns that were completely consistent with successful farming operations, while his apparent social isolation was understood and accepted as the natural behavior of a man who was still recovering from emotional trauma and who preferred solitary work to social interaction. He would begin each day before dawn, and neighbors who were early risers could see lights in his kitchen and barn as he prepared for another day of agricultural work that required careful planning and systematic execution. The sound of his equipment starting up would carry across the valley in the early morning stillness, providing a familiar audio backdrop that had become part of the community's daily rhythm and a reassuring indication that Marcus was maintaining his commitment to the farming lifestyle that had brought him to Nebraska. His fieldwork followed seasonal patterns that demonstrated his understanding of agricultural timing and his commitment to maximizing productivity through careful attention to optimal planting, cultivation, and harvesting schedules. During spring planting season, he would work from dawn until well after dark, taking advantage of favorable weather conditions and soil moisture levels to ensure that his crops were established under optimal conditions that would support maximum yield potential. Summer cultivation and crop maintenance activities would find Marcus in his fields regularly throughout the growing season, monitoring crop development, adjusting irrigation systems, and implementing pest management strategies that kept his corn and soybean crops healthy and productive while neighboring farmers struggled with weather stress, insect damage, and disease problems that could significantly reduce yields and threaten profitability. Harvest season showcased Marcus's efficiency and expertise most dramatically, as he could complete his crop harvesting faster and with less grain loss than most farmers in the region, despite operating with less equipment and fewer personnel than larger farming operations that had more resources and greater economies of scale. His ability to work alone while maintaining high standards of quality and efficiency had become legendary within the agricultural community, earning him respect and admiration from neighbors who understood how difficult it was to manage all aspects of a complex farming operation without assistance from family members or hired employees. His equipment maintenance activities provided another visible demonstration of his agricultural expertise and mechanical capabilities. Neighbors would often see him working in his machine shop during evening hours and weekend periods when field work was not possible, repairing and maintaining the tractors, planters, cultivators, and harvesting equipment that were essential for his farming operations' success. The shop's frequent activity served multiple purposes for Marcus's operational security. The noise and lights provided logical explanations for evening and weekend activities that were actually related to maintaining communication equipment and security systems, while the shop's legitimate equipment repair functions provided cover for activities that required technical skills and specialized tools that might otherwise seem unusual for a bachelor farmer's operation. Marcus's social activities were limited, but consistent with community expectations for someone who was still recovering from a difficult divorce and who preferred to focus on rebuilding his financial situation rather than pursuing new personal relationships or extensive social engagement. He would attend community meetings when agricultural issues were being discussed, participate in cooperative activities that required coordinated planning among area farmers, and volunteer for emergency response activities that required additional manpower or specialized skills. His participation in church services at the community center was regular, but not ostentatious, reflecting what appeared to be genuine religious faith, combined with an understanding that church attendance was expected behavior for community members who wanted to maintain good relationships with their neighbors. He would arrive punctually, participate respectfully in services and fellowship activities, and leave promptly without engaging in extended social conversations that might lead to uncomfortable questions about his personal life or background. Marcus's shopping and business activities followed patterns that demonstrated his commitment to supporting local businesses while maintaining the financial discipline that was necessary for his farming operations' long-term success. He would make weekly trips to Peterson's general store for groceries and supplies, monthly visits to the grain elevator for crop marketing and storage activities, and periodic appointments with Ed Miller for insurance and regulatory compliance requirements. His interactions during these business activities were friendly but brief, focused on completing necessary transactions rather than engaging in extended social conversations that might lead to personal questions or expectations for greater social involvement. Community members interpreted this behavior as evidence of his continued emotional recovery from his divorce and his dedication to rebuilding his life through agricultural success rather than social activities that might distract from his farming priorities. What neighbors didn't realize was that Marcus's apparent social isolation was actually carefully managed operational security that allowed him to maintain his cover identity, while minimizing risks to his family's safety and his operations' security. Every interaction was planned and controlled to provide necessary community integration, while avoiding situations that might lead to discovery of inconsistencies in his background story or exposure of activities that were inconsistent with his claimed identity as a bachelor farmer. His evening and weekend activities were particularly important for maintaining operational security, while providing necessary family time and emotional support for his wife and children who remained hidden. In the underground facility, neighbors who occasionally saw lights in his house during evening hours would assume he was relaxing after long days of physical labor, watching television, reading, or engaging in other solitary activities that would be normal for a man who was living alone and recovering from personal losses. The reality was that these evening hours were when Marcus could safely spend time with his family, helping with homework, reading bedtime stories, playing games, and providing the emotional connection and parental guidance that his children needed to maintain their psychological health and development despite their extraordinary living circumstances. These family activities occurred in spaces that were completely concealed from outside observation, allowing Sarah and the children to speak in normal voices, move freely, and engage in family activities that provided some normalcy despite their underground existence. Marcus's weekend activities appeared to focus on equipment maintenance, property improvement projects, and preparation for upcoming farming activities, all of which provided logical explanations for increased activity around his buildings and the sounds of tools and equipment that neighbors might notice during periods when most farming operations were relatively quiet. In reality, weekends were when Marcus could conduct more extensive security maintenance, communication activities, and family activities that required additional time and attention. The underground facility systems required regular maintenance, and testing to ensure their continued reliability. Communication equipment needed periodic updates and security checks, and his family required extended periods of interaction and emotional support that could only be provided when the risks of discovery were minimized. The community's acceptance of Marcus's routine and social patterns had been essential for maintaining his operational security while providing his family with the safety and stability they needed to survive their dangerous circumstances. Neighbors had learned to expect his predictable activities and respect his apparent need for privacy and limited social interaction, creating an environment where he could maintain his cover identity without constantly worrying about explaining inconsistencies or managing unwanted attention that might compromise his family's safety. This acceptance and protection had been built through 8 years of consistent behavior, genuine agricultural success, and respectful community interaction that had established Marcus as a valued neighbor and community member despite his personal challenges and social limitations. The community had invested emotionally in his success and recovery, creating a protective environment that would make any future revelation about his true identity and circumstances even more shocking and difficult to process. As Marcus completed his 8th year in Millbrook Valley, he had achieved something that even his federal protection handlers had not thought possible: complete integration into a community that not only accepted his cover identity, but actively protected it through their loyalty, discretion, and emotional investment in his success as a neighbor, farmer, and recovering individual who had earned their respect and deserved their support. Looking back, people of Millbrook Valley would realize that the signs had been there all along: subtle inconsistencies in Marcus Thompson's story, unexplained capabilities that seemed impossible for a divorced farmer from Iowa, and mysterious behaviors that everyone had accepted as the quirks of a man recovering from personal trauma, rather than evidence of a double life that would have been unimaginable to the residents of their quiet Nebraska farming community. Pete Peterson would later tell federal investigators that he had always sensed something different about Marcus. Though he had never been able to articulate exactly what it was, there was something in the way he carried himself, Pete would recall, like he was always watching everything around him, even when he seemed to be focused on something else. And his knowledge, he knew things about farming that you don't learn from books or even from 15 years working someone else's land. But these observations had been dismissed as the overthinking of an elderly man who had lived through enough changes in Millbrook Valley to be naturally suspicious of anyone new, especially someone who seemed too good to be true. The community had wanted Marcus's story to be genuine, had needed his success to represent hope for their struggling agricultural region, and had collectively chosen to overlook the details that didn't quite fit the narrative they had embraced. Marcus's agricultural abilities had become legendary throughout southeastern Nebraska, drawing visitors from as far as Omaha and Kansas City, who had heard about the divorced farmer who could solve problems that stumped agricultural extension, agents with decades of experience. But his methods were unlike anything other farmers had ever encountered, relying on equipment analysis and problem-solving techniques that seemed to belong in a laboratory rather than a cornfield. His diagnostic abilities were the first anomaly that should have raised questions. Marcus could identify crop diseases by examining symptoms that other farmers couldn't even see, using observation techniques that seemed to involve systematic analysis of factors that weren't typically considered in agricultural problem-solving. When Jim Kowalski's corn developed what appeared to be routine nutrient deficiency, Marcus had spent 20 minutes walking through the field, examining soil conditions, plant spacing, and environmental factors before identifying a subtle irrigation problem that was creating localized salt buildup, a diagnosis that proved accurate when soil testing confirmed his assessment. He could see patterns that the rest of us missed, Jim would later tell investigators. It wasn't just experience, it was like he had been trained to analyze complex systems and identify problems that weren't obvious. When I asked him where he had learned those techniques, he said he had picked them up from agricultural magazines and extension service publications. But those weren't things you could learn from reading. They were systematic approaches that suggested formal training in analytical methods. Marcus's equipment repair capabilities were even more puzzling to neighbors, who understood enough about mechanical systems to recognize that his knowledge exceeded what would be expected from typical farming experience. He could diagnose electronic problems in modern agricultural equipment using testing procedures that required specialized knowledge of computer systems and diagnostic protocols that weren't taught in standard agricultural mechanics programs. During harvest season in his 5th year, Marcus had repaired Ed Miller's combine harvester when the computerized control system failed during a critical period when delays could have resulted in significant crop losses. The repair had required him to access diagnostic codes and programming interfaces that were typically only available to certified technicians. Using procedures that suggested training in electronic systems and computer programming that was inconsistent with his claimed background as someone who had learned mechanical skills through practical farming experience, that wasn't something you figure out by trial and error, Ed would later explain to federal investigators. Marcus knew exactly which diagnostic protocols to run and how to interpret the error codes that the system was generating. When I asked him where he had learned about combined computer systems, he said he had worked on similar equipment in Iowa, but the procedures he used were more sophisticated than what most dealership technicians could handle. Marcus's weather prediction abilities bordered on supernatural, consistently allowing him to make planting and harvesting decisions that resulted in optimal timing and maximum yields, while neighbors who relied on conventional weather forecasting. Services struggled with timing decisions that could make the difference between profitable and unprofitable crop years. His predictions were based on observation techniques and analytical methods that seemed to involve factors that weren't typically considered in agricultural weather planning. He would spend early morning hours examining atmospheric conditions, wind patterns, and environmental indicators that provided information about weather changes that wouldn't become apparent through conventional forecasting until hours or days later. His ability to predict the timing and intensity of precipitation events was particularly remarkable. It's allowing him to complete critical farming activities just before weather conditions changed in ways that would have made those activities impossible or significantly less effective. Dr. Fisher had been amazed by Marcus's knowledge of emergency medical procedures. During a farming accident in his 6th year, when a neighboring farmer had been injured by equipment malfunction and required immediate medical attention before professional emergency services could arrive, Marcus had assessed the victim's injuries, applied appropriate first aid techniques, and managed the emergency response with a level of competence that suggested training far beyond the basic first aid courses that were commonly available to rural residents. His medical knowledge was too sophisticated for someone who had learned first aid through farming safety programs. Dr. Fisher would later tell investigators he understood trauma assessment procedures, knew how to manage shock and bleeding, and demonstrated familiarity with emergency protocols that suggested formal training in emergency response. When I asked him about his medical background, he said he had taken safety courses when he worked on his father-in-law's farm in Iowa, but those weren't skills you learn in basic safety training. Marcus's concern about property security had been attributed to his experience with divorce-related harassment and his understanding of rural crime, patterns that could threaten farming operations, but his actual security measures far exceeded what would be reasonable for protecting agricultural equipment and preventing routine theft or vandalism. His farm was equipped with surveillance systems that could monitor approaches from multiple directions, detection devices that could identify unauthorized intrusion attempts, and communication systems that could instantly alert law enforcement. 2 potential threats. The security equipment installation had been explained as necessary protection for valuable farming equipment and grain storage facilities that could be targets for theft, especially during harvest season when commodity prices were high and stored grain represented significant financial value. Marcus had told neighbors that his divorce experience had made him particularly cautious about security, because his ex-wife's family had threatened harassment and property damage that could destroy his farming operation and force him to abandon his fresh start in Nebraska. But security experts would later recognize the installation as a professional-grade defensive system designed to protect against threats far more serious than typical rural crime. The surveillance cameras were positioned to provide overlapping coverage that eliminated blind spots and created comprehensive monitoring of all potential approach routes to the farmstead. The motion detection systems were calibrated to distinguish between routine animal activity and human intrusion attempts, reducing false alarms while maintaining sensitivity to genuine security threats. Most sophisticated were the communication systems that could instantly notify multiple emergency response agencies while providing real-time situation updates that would allow law enforcement to coordinate appropriate responses based on the nature and severity of detected threats. The system included backup power supplies, redundant communication channels, and automated protocols that could continue functioning even if primary systems were compromised or if Marcus was unable to manually operate the equipment. Chief Deputy Walsh had noticed the sophisticated security measures during routine patrol visits, but he had interpreted them as evidence of Marcus's cautious personality and his legitimate concerns about protecting valuable property in an isolated location, where emergency response times could be lengthy. The security system seemed excessive for a farming operation, Walsh would later admit to federal investigators. But it made sense if you understood that he was trying to protect himself from continued harassment related to his divorce. I thought it showed good planning and reasonable caution for someone who was living alone in an isolated area. The property's physical security modifications were equally sophisticated, involving structural improvements that appeared to be routine, building maintenance but actually created defensive capabilities that could protect against forced entry or assault by multiple attackers using professional equipment and tactics. The farmhouse windows had been replaced with units that appeared standard, but included reinforced frames and impact-resistant glass that could withstand significant force. Without failing, the barn and machine shop had been modified with concealed steel reinforcement that could resist penetration by small arms fire, while maintaining the appearance of typical agricultural buildings that wouldn't attract attention or generate questions from neighbors who were familiar with standard farming infrastructure. The modifications included escape routes, defensive positions, and supply storage areas that could support extended resistance against assault by well-equipped attackers. Marcus's personal security habits were another area where his law enforcement training was evident to anyone who understood what to look for. He maintained constant situational awareness, positioning himself to observe all entrances and potential threats whenever he was in public spaces. He varied his routines to avoid predictable patterns that could be exploited by hostile surveillance, and he demonstrated defensive skills and tactical awareness that were inconsistent with his claimed background. As a farmer who had learned caution through personal experience with domestic conflict, during a community meeting in his 4th year, when tensions arose between farmers and county officials over environmental regulations, Marcus had positioned himself near the room's rear exit, maintaining visual contact with all attendees while avoiding positions that could trap him. If the meeting became confrontational, his awareness of group dynamics and potential conflict escalation suggested training in crowd control and threat assessment that went far beyond normal social skills or agricultural experience. He watched people the way a police officer watches a crowd, Ed Miller would later recall, not obviously, but constantly. Like he was always evaluating who might become a problem and planning how he would respond if things went wrong. When I mentioned it to him, he said his divorce had made him nervous about confrontational situations, but his behavior was more like someone who had been trained to assess and manage security threats. Marcus's financial situation was another area where careful observation might have revealed inconsistencies that contradicted his story of economic struggle and gradual recovery from divorce-related financial losses. While he maintained the appearance of operating on tight margins and managing resources carefully, his actual spending patterns suggested access to capital that wasn't reflected in his visible income from agricultural operations or explained by his claimed financial history. His equipment purchases were the most obvious anomaly. Marcus had invested in diagnostic tools, farming equipment, and facility improvements that would typically require significant capital investment or financing, arrangements that would be difficult for someone with his claimed credit history and limited collateral to obtain, but he always paid cash for major purchases. never applied for agricultural loans through conventional banking channels, and seemed to have access to funding sources that weren't connected to traditional agricultural finance or equipment leasing programs. Robert Chen, the loan officer at Millbrook Valley Community Bank, has been puzzled by Marcus's minimal use of banking services. Despite operating what appeared to be a successful and growing agricultural operation, he maintained a basic checking account for routine transactions and occasionally used our safe deposit box services, Chen would later tell investigators. But he never applied for operating loans or equipment financing that most farmers needed. To manage cash flow and capital investments, for someone who was supposedly rebuilding after financial losses, he seemed remarkably self-sufficient financially. Marcus's living expenses were equally mysterious. He maintained a modest lifestyle that was consistent with his claimed financial situation. He was able to provide himself with resources and conveniences that exceeded what would be expected. For someone who was supposedly operating on minimal margins while rebuilding from divorce-related losses, his grocery purchases, utility usage, and general consumption patterns suggested resource availability that wasn't reflected in his apparent income or financial history. The property improvements he had made to the farmstead represented another financial puzzle. While the improvements appeared to be routine maintenance and practical upgrades that would be expected for someone trying to restore a neglected property to productive condition, the actual scope and cost of the work exceeded what would typically be affordable for a farmer operating with limited capital and no established credit relationships with local contractors or suppliers. Marcus had somehow managed to completely renovate the farmhouse interior, upgrade all electrical and plumbing systems, install sophisticated security equipment, and construct a state-of-the-art machine shop, all while maintaining the external appearance of a modest farming operation that was being improved gradually as resources became available. The improvements were expertly concealed and appeared to be the result of gradual investment over several years. But the total value represented a level of expenditure that would have been difficult to achieve through agricultural income alone. His insurance coverage represented another area, where his financial capabilities seemed inconsistent with his claimed situation. Marcus maintained comprehensive protection that included property coverage, liability insurance, crop insurance, and specialized coverage for equipment and business interruption that exceeded what most farming operations in the region could afford. The coverage levels and policy features suggested both significant assets to protect and financial resources that weren't reflected in his apparent income or business size. Ed Miller had been impressed by Marcus's sophisticated understanding of insurance requirements and risk management strategies that typically required consultation with specialized agents or extensive experience with complex agricultural operations. He knew exactly what coverage he needed and was willing to pay for comprehensive protection that most farmers in the area couldn't afford, Miller would later explain. When I asked him about his insurance background, he said he had learned about risk management during his divorce proceedings. But his knowledge was more sophisticated than what someone would learn through personal legal experience. Marcus's tax situation provided additional evidence of financial resources that didn't match his story while he filed all required returns and maintained compliance with agricultural tax requirements. His reported income and deductions suggested business activities and income sources that weren't fully reflected in his visible farming operations. His tax preparation was handled by a certified public accountant in Lincoln rather than the local accounting services that most area farmers used. And his financial records demonstrated organizational sophistication that exceeded what would be expected for a small farming operation. Marcus's conversations with community members occasionally revealed expertise that seemed inconsistent with his background as a divorced farmer from Iowa who had learned agriculture through practical experience. An agricultural college education, he would demonstrate understanding of advanced agricultural science, law enforcement procedures, and technical subjects that suggested formal training and professional experience that went beyond what would be expected from someone with his claimed educational and employment history. During discussions about agricultural policy and environmental regulations, Marcus would make detailed comments about federal law enforcement procedures, legal precedents, and regulatory compliance requirements that impressed the few community members who had experience with government agencies but puzzled others, who wondered where a farmer would have acquired such specialized knowledge. His understanding of evidence requirements, investigation procedures, and legal protocols suggested familiarity with law enforcement operations that was inconsistent with his claimed background as someone whose only contact with legal systems had been through divorce proceedings. He understood how federal agencies operated and what their capabilities and limitations were. Chief Deputy Walsh would later tell investigators, when we discussed agricultural inspections or environmental compliance issues, he would ask questions about jurisdiction, evidence standards, and procedural requirements that suggested he understood law enforcement operations from the inside. When I asked him about his knowledge, he said he had dealt with agricultural inspectors during disputes with his ex-wife's family. But his understanding was too detailed for someone who had only been on the receiving end of investigations. Marcus's familiarity with weapons and tactical equipment was another area, where his background didn't match his claimed experience. During discussions about hunting and farm security, he would demonstrate knowledge of firearms, ammunition, and tactical equipment that exceeded what would be expected from typical hunting and farm protection applications. His understanding of ballistics, weapon selection, tactical applications suggested formal training in law enforcement or military applications rather than recreational hunting or agricultural pest control. When Ed Miller had purchased a new rifle for deer hunting and had asked Marcus for advice about scope selection and ammunition choices, Marcus had provided detailed recommendations that included considerations of terminal ballistics, accuracy, requirements, and equipment reliability that were more sophisticated than typical hunting applications would require. His knowledge included familiarity with law enforcement and tactical ammunition that wasn't commonly available through sporting goods stores or discussed in hunting publications. He knew things about weapons and ammunition that you don't learn from hunting magazines, Miller would later recall. And I asked him where he had learned so much about firearms. He said he had been interested in target shooting and had done research about accuracy and performance. But his knowledge included tactical applications and law enforcement equipment that suggested professional experience rather than recreational interest. Marcus's understanding of surveillance techniques and counter-surveillance methods was evident. During conversations about farm security and protection against theft or vandalism, he would discuss observation techniques, detection methods, and security planning approaches that demonstrated familiarity with professional surveillance operations and anti-surveillance tactics that were far more sophisticated than what would be needed for protecting agricultural operations against routine criminal activity. During a community meeting about rural crime prevention, Marcus had provided detailed recommendations about security planning, threat assessment, and protective measures that impressed local law enforcement officials, but seemed unusually sophisticated. For a farmer whose security concerns were supposedly related to divorce-related harassment and agricultural theft prevention, his recommendations included operational security practices and threat evaluation methods that suggested formal training in personal protection and security operations. His security knowledge was too advanced for someone who had learned about protection through personal experience with harassment, Chief Deputy Walsh would later admit. He understood surveillance techniques, threat assessment procedures, and security planning methods that are typically only taught in law enforcement or security training programs. When I asked him about his background, he said he had researched security methods after his divorce made him concerned about personal safety, but his knowledge was professional level rather than self-taught. Marcus's communication habits included behaviors that suggested connections and responsibilities beyond those of a typical farming operation, though these patterns were subtle enough that they were generally overlooked by neighbors who weren't familiar with the technical aspects of electronic communication or the operational requirements of covert activities. He maintained multiple communication devices, received calls and messages at unusual hours, demonstrated familiarity with electronic security and communication protocols that exceeded what would be expected for agricultural business applications. His cell phone usage patterns were the first indication that his communication requirements went beyond typical farming business needs. Marcus carried multiple devices, claiming that one was for business use and another was for personal communication. but the frequency and timing of calls and messages on both devices suggested more complex communication requirements than would be needed for managing agricultural operations and maintaining personal relationships with family members in Iowa. Local cell tower records, which would later be analyzed by federal investigators, showed that Marcus's phones were accessing networks and services that weren't available to typical civilian customers. His data usage patterns indicated encrypted communications, secure file transfers, and access to databases that required specialized authorization and security clearances. The technical signatures of his communication activities were consistent with law enforcement operations rather than agricultural business communications or personal correspondence. Pete Peterson had noticed that Marcus would often step outside or move to private areas of the store when receiving phone calls, explaining that he preferred to handle business conversations privately rather than discussing financial or operational matters where other customers might overhear sensitive information. But the frequency and apparent urgency of these calls suggested communication requirements that went beyond routine agricultural business or personal conversations with family members. He would get calls at all hours, Peterson would later tell investigators. Early morning, late evening, even during church services when most people wouldn't call unless it was an emergency. When I mentioned it, he said he was dealing with legal issues related to his divorce and that his attorney needed to reach him at irregular hours because of court schedules and time zone differences. But the pattern seemed more like someone who was on call for some kind of professional responsibility. Marcus's internet usage also suggested activities that went beyond typical farming applications or personal entertainment. His internet service requirements exceeded what would be needed for agricultural business, weather monitoring, or commodity price tracking. And he had invested in communication equipment and network infrastructure that seemed more sophisticated than what would be justified for a small farming operations business needs. The internet equipment at his farmstead included satellite communication capabilities, backup power systems, and redundant connection methods that could maintain communication, even during power outages or service interruptions that might affect conventional internet access. His network security measures included encryption protocols and access controls that were more sophisticated than what would be needed to protect agricultural business records or personal financial information. Jim Kowalski had been impressed by Marcus's computer capabilities when he had helped troubleshoot grain marketing software that had been experiencing compatibility problems with the elevator's computer systems. Marcus had demonstrated familiarity with network protocols, software configuration, and system administration that seemed to exceed what would be expected from someone whose computer experience was limited to agricultural applications and personal use. He understood computer systems and networking in ways that suggested formal training or extensive professional experience, Kowalski would later recall. When I asked him where he had learned so much about computers, he said he had taken some classes and had taught himself through online resources. But his knowledge was too detailed and current for someone who had learned through casual study. Marcus's physical capabilities and reflexes occasionally revealed evidence of training that was inconsistent with his civilian background. Though these demonstrations were subtle enough that they were generally attributed to natural athletic ability or fitness habits that he had maintained from his younger years. His coordination, strength, and situational awareness exceeded what would be expected for someone whose primary physical activity was agricultural work. And his responses to unexpected situations suggested training in defensive tactics and emergency response procedures. His defensive capabilities had been most clearly demonstrated during an incident in his 6th year, when an intoxicated driver had become aggressive after accidentally driving onto Marcus's property and getting stuck in a muddy field during spring planting season. The driver had blamed Marcus for the road conditions and had become increasingly hostile when Marcus had politely offered to help extract the vehicle using his tractor. When the driver had stepped out of his vehicle and had begun approaching Marcus in a threatening manner, Marcus's response had been swift and decisive. He had assessed the threat, positioned himself for optimal defensive advantage, and managed the confrontation with techniques that suggested professional training in conflict. De-escalation and physical control rather than the improvised responses. That would be expected from someone who had learned self-defense through personal experience or basic self-defense courses. The incident had lasted less than 2 minutes, ending when the driver realized that Marcus was not intimidated and was prepared to defend himself if necessary. But witnesses had been impressed by Marcus's calm professionalism and his ability to control the situation without escalating the conflict or using excessive force. His techniques had been those of someone trained in law enforcement or security applications rather than civilian self-defense methods. He handled it like a police officer, Ed Miller, who had witnessed the incident, would later tell investigators. Not aggressive, but completely in control, like he had been trained to manage dangerous situations without making them worse. I asked him where he had learned those techniques. He said he had taken some self-defense classes after his divorce made him concerned about personal safety. But his response was too professional for civilian training. Marcus's driving skills were another area where his capabilities exceeded what would be expected from typical civilian experience. During emergency situations, such as responding to agricultural accidents or severe weather emergencies, Marcus demonstrated vehicle handling capabilities that suggested advanced driver training, beyond what would be acquired through normal farming experience or civilian driving education. His vehicle control during difficult conditions, his ability to maintain safety and efficiency during high-stress driving situations, and his knowledge of emergency response driving techniques suggested formal training in pursuit driving, emergency response, or security applications that were inconsistent with his claimed background as a farmer whose driving experience was limited to agricultural equipment and personal transportation. Chief Deputy Walsh had been impressed by Marcus's driving capabilities during a severe weather emergency when multiple accidents had occurred. Simultaneously, an additional emergency response capability had been needed to assist stranded motorists and coordinate evacuation activities. Marcus had volunteered to assist with emergency transportation and had demonstrated driving skills that had impressed law enforcement officials who were trained in emergency response driving. His vehicle handling was too good for someone who had learned to drive farm equipment and pickup trucks, Walsh would later admit. He understood emergency driving techniques, vehicle dynamics, and safety procedures that are typically only taught in law enforcement or emergency response training programs. When I complimented his driving skills, he said he had always been interested in automotive performance and had practiced advanced driving techniques as a hobby. But his capabilities suggested professional training rather than recreational interest. Marcus's marksmanship abilities were evident during community activities that involved firearms, such as pest control activities or hunting situations where his accuracy and weapon handling skills demonstrated training that exceeded what would be expected from recreational hunting or agricultural pest management applications. His shooting techniques, safety procedures, equipment knowledge suggested formal marksmanship training and regular practice with firearms and tactical rather than recreational applications. During a community effort to address predator problems that were threatening livestock operations, Marcus had demonstrated shooting accuracy and weapon handling that had impressed hunters and farmers who had decades of firearms experience. His shooting positions, breathing techniques, and accuracy under pressure suggested training in law enforcement or military marksmanship. Rather than hunting or recreational shooting applications, he could shoot better than anyone I've ever seen, outside of law enforcement or military. A neighboring farmer would later tell investigators, his accuracy was incredible, and his weapon handling showed training that you don't get from hunting or target shooting. When I asked him where he had learned to shoot so well, he said he had always been interested in precision shooting and had practiced extensively during his time in Iowa. But his techniques were too advanced for civilian training. Despite these numerous anomalies and inconsistencies, the community of Millbrook Valley had collectively chosen to accept Marcus's explanations and avoid asking questions that might have revealed uncomfortable truths about his background and activities. They had needed his success story to represent hope for their struggling agricultural community, and they had wanted to believe that his exceptional capabilities were the result of natural talent, hard work and determination rather than professional training and experience that was inconsistent with his claimed identity. The residents who had noticed unusual aspects of Marcus's operation had convinced themselves that their observations were explainable through his traumatic divorce experience, his exceptional intelligence and dedication, or his natural abilities that had been enhanced through agricultural education and practical farming experience. They had wanted to protect his privacy and support his recovery from personal losses, creating an environment where increasingly obvious inconsistencies could be dismissed or rationalized away rather than investigated or questioned. This collective willingness to overlook evidence had been essential for maintaining Marcus's operational security, but it had also created a situation where obvious signs of his law enforcement background and ongoing federal protection status could be ignored by people who had become emotionally invested in protecting his secrets even without understanding what those secrets were, or why their protection was essential for his family's survival. October 15, 2024, started like any other autumn morning in Millbrook Valley. Marcus Thompson had woken before dawn to begin what should have been a routine day of corn harvesting, the kind of work that defined the rhythm of agricultural life and had provided him with perfect cover for 8 years of living one of the most extraordinary double lives in the history of federal witness protection programs. At 5:30 a.m., Marcus was already in his fields, operating his combine harvester with the methodical precision that neighbors had come to expect from the man they knew as their most successful and dedicated farmer. The morning air was crisp with the promise of winter. The corn was at perfect moisture content for harvesting, conditions that would allow him to complete another profitable season while maintaining the agricultural success that had made him a respected member of the Millbrook Valley community. Emma had celebrated her 22nd birthday the week before. Hidden in the underground facility that had been her home for 8 years, Michael, now 20, was helping manage the family's security systems and had become proficient in the communication protocols that kept them connected to their federal protection handlers. Little Sophie, who was no longer little at 16, had developed into a remarkably mature young woman who dreamed of someday attending college and becoming a teacher. Like her mother had been before, their lives were forever changed by her father's decision to testify against the Fontaine crime family. Sarah had adapted to their underground existence with the strength and creativity that had made her an exceptional middle school teacher, creating educational programs and family traditions that had allowed their children to develop into remarkable young adults despite their extraordinary circumstances. She had homeschooled all 3 children to educational levels that exceeded what they would have achieved in traditional schools, while also providing the emotional support and family stability that had enabled them to maintain hope for a future when they could live openly without fear. But on this particular October morning, convergence of seemingly random events was about to shatter 8 years of perfect operational security and expose one of the most heart-wrenching stories of sacrifice and family devotion in the history of American law enforcement. At exactly 11:23 a.m., as Marcus was completing his third pass through the 40-acre cornfield adjacent to State Highway 34, the weather conditions that had been perfect for harvesting began to change with the sudden intensity that characterized Nebraska autumn storms. What meteorologists would later classify as a derecho, a widespread, long-lived windstorm associated with bands of rapidly moving showers or thunderstorms, began forming over the valley with unusual speed and devastating power. The storm. The system had developed much faster than conventional weather forecasting had predicted, creating conditions that would test every aspect of the security and emergency preparedness systems that Marcus had spent 8 years perfecting. Within minutes, straight-line winds exceeding 80 miles per hour were tearing across the valley, accompanied by torrential rainfall that reduced visibility to near zero and created flash flooding conditions that made normal transportation impossible. Marcus's first priority was securing his agricultural equipment and ensuring that his family was safe in the underground facility. But the storm's intensity made it impossible to return to the farmstead using normal routes. The combine harvester was too large and slow to outrun the approaching storm front, and the rural roads between his field location and the farm buildings were already becoming impassable due to flooding and debris from damaged trees and structures. as he struggled to navigate the massive harvesting equipment through increasingly dangerous conditions. Marcus made the split-second decision that would change everything for his family and the Millbrook Valley community. Rather than attempting to reach the farmstead and potentially exposing his family to discovery during emergency response activities, he chose to seek shelter at Peterson's general store, which was closer to his field location and would provide safety while allowing him to monitor emergency communications and coordinate with his family through secure channels. But this decision, which seemed logical under the circumstances, would place him at the center of community emergency response activities that would make it impossible to maintain. The careful separation between his public identity and his private responsibilities that had been essential for 8 years of successful operational security. Peterson's General Store had become the unofficial emergency coordination center for Millbrook Valley, as it was the only building in the community that had both reliable communication equipment and sufficient space to accommodate the emergency. Responders and displaced residents who were seeking shelter from the storm. Pete Peterson, despite being 67 years old, had taken charge of coordinating rescue efforts and maintaining communication with county emergency services that were struggling to respond to multiple simultaneous emergencies throughout the region. Within an hour of the storm's arrival, the store was sheltering over 30 people, including farm families whose homes had been damaged by the wind, elderly residents who had lost power and heating, and emergency responders who were using the location as a staging area for rescue operations throughout the valley. The storm had knocked out normal communication systems, making it essential to rely on backup radio equipment and satellite communication devices that were typically used only during the most serious emergency situations. Marcus found himself in an impossible situation. His training and instincts as a former police detective made him naturally suited to assist with emergency coordination and rescue operations, but any leadership role would expose him to the kind of scrutiny and attention that could compromise his cover identity and potentially endanger his family. At the same time, people were in immediate danger, and his capabilities could mean the difference between life and death for community members who had protected and supported him for 8 years. The crisis that forced his hand came when Chief Deputy Walsh received a radio report that the Kowalski farmstead, located in a low-lying area near Willow Creek, was experiencing severe flooding that had trapped Jim Kowalski's elderly parents in their home with rapidly rising water that threatened to make rescue impossible within a matter of hours. The standard emergency response protocols required coordinating with state emergency services and waiting for specialized water rescue equipment. But the timeline for official response made it unlikely that help would arrive before the flooding became fatal. "We need someone who understands water rescue techniques and can coordinate a civilian rescue effort using local equipment," Chief Deputy Walsh announced to the group sheltering in Peterson's store. "The county rescue team can't reach the Kowalski place for at least 3 hours, and we don't have 3 hours." Marcus realized that remaining silent would likely result in the deaths of people who had welcomed him into their community and had protected his family's secret without ever knowing they were doing so. His law enforcement training included water rescue certification and emergency response coordination experience that could save lives. But using those skills would expose capabilities that were inconsistent with his claimed background as a divorced farmer from Iowa. The moment of truth came when Marcus stepped forward and began organizing the rescue effort with the calm professionalism and systematic approach that immediately revealed his law enforcement background to anyone who understood what they were observing. Marcus's transformation from quiet farmer to emergency response coordinator was so complete and dramatic that everyone in Peterson's store immediately recognized they were witnessing something extraordinary. His knowledge of rescue protocols, his understanding of emergency equipment capabilities, and his ability to coordinate complex operations under extreme pressure demonstrated training and experience that was impossible to explain through his claimed civilian background. He quickly assessed available resources, identified local residents who had relevant skills or equipment that could support the rescue effort, and developed a comprehensive plan that addressed both immediate rescue needs and secondary safety concerns that weren't immediately obvious. 2 civilian observers, His approach included backup contingencies, safety protocols, communication procedures that reflected formal training in emergency response operations rather than improvised problem-solving based on common sense and good intentions. Marcus took charge like he had been doing it his whole life. Pete Peterson would later tell federal investigators, not pushy or arrogant, but with the kind of calm confidence that made everyone trust his judgment and follow his directions. Without question, he knew exactly what needed to be done and how to do it safely. And he understood emergency procedures that you don't learn from farming experience or civilian disaster preparedness training. The rescue operation required coordinating multiple teams using agricultural equipment that had been modified for water rescue applications. Communication protocols that ensured safety and efficiency despite challenging conditions and risk management. Strategies that protected both rescue personnel and the victims they were trying to save. Marcus's ability to manage these complex requirements simultaneously, while maintaining awareness of changing conditions and potential additional threats demonstrated expertise that was clearly the result of professional training and extensive experience. Most revealing were the radio communication techniques that Marcus used to coordinate the rescue effort with county emergency services and other response agencies. His familiarity with emergency communication protocols, his understanding of multi-agency coordination procedures, and his knowledge of law enforcement terminology and operational requirements made it obvious to Chief Deputy Walsh that Marcus had extensive experience working within law enforcement and emergency response systems. He knew things about police procedures and emergency operations that civilians don't learn, Walsh would later admit to federal investigators. He understood jurisdictional issues, evidence preservation requirements, and interagency communication protocols that are only taught in law enforcement training programs. When I asked him about his background, he said he had volunteered with emergency services in Iowa, but his knowledge was too detailed and current for volunteer training. The rescue operation was completed successfully with Jim Kowalski's parents evacuated safely and additional flood victims rescued from other locations throughout the valley. But Marcus's leadership during the emergency had exposed capabilities and knowledge that made it impossible for anyone who had observed his performance to continue believing that he was simply a divorced farmer who had learned leadership skills. Through agricultural education and life experience, Chief Deputy Walsh had been impressed by Marcus's performance during the emergency response, but he had also been troubled by the obvious inconsistencies between Marcus's claimed background and his demonstrated capabilities. The rescue operation had revealed knowledge of law enforcement procedures, emergency response protocols, and tactical coordination techniques that suggested professional training. An experience that was inconsistent with Marcus's story about being a divorced farmer from Iowa. Walsh's initial inquiries were routine and respectful, motivated by curiosity rather than suspicion. But Marcus's responses to questions about his emergency response background created additional inconsistencies that raised more serious concerns about his identity and the accuracy of the personal history he had provided to the community over the past 8 years. When Walsh asked about Marcus's volunteer emergency services experience in Iowa, Marcus provided details that seemed plausible but couldn't be verified through normal channels. The organizations he mentioned existed, but their records didn't include anyone matching Marcus's description or claimed service history. The training programs he described were accurate in their general details, but his knowledge of specific procedures and protocols exceeded what would be available through civilian volunteer training programs. More concerning were the technical capabilities that Marcus had demonstrated during the rescue operation, including familiarity with radio equipment, emergency coordination software, interagency communication protocols that were typically restricted to professional emergency responders and law enforcement personnel. His understanding of these systems suggested current knowledge and recent training rather than outdated information from volunteer service that had ended years earlier. Walsh's growing suspicions were confirmed when he attempted to verify Marcus's identity through routine background checks that had never been conducted during his 8 years in Millbrook Valley. The social security number, driver's license information, and personal history details that Marcus had provided were all genuine and properly documented. But deeper investigation revealed that the documentation had been created recently and that there were no records of Marcus Thompson's existence prior to his arrival in Nebraska in 2016. Everything checked out on the surface, Walsh would later explain to federal investigators. But when I dug deeper, it became obvious that his identity had been constructed rather than developed naturally over a lifetime. The documentation was too perfect, too clean, like someone had created a complete identity for him using official systems and procedures. The breakthrough came when Walsh contacted the FBI's regional office in Omaha to report his suspicions about a potential identity fraud case, explaining that a longtime community member appeared to be using false documentation and might be involved in criminal activities that required federal investigation. The FBI agent who received Walsh's call immediately recognized the situation as a potential witness. Protection, security breach, and initiated protocols for managing the exposure of a protected witness. Within 6 hours of Walsh's initial contact with federal authorities, Millbrook Valley was occupied by FBI agents, U.S. Marshals, and other federal personnel who were implementing emergency procedures for protecting Marcus and his family, while managing the security implications of his exposure. The response was so swift and overwhelming that it confirmed Walsh's suspicions that Marcus's situation involved far more serious circumstances than simple identity fraud or civilian criminal activity. The federal agent's first priority was locating and securing Marcus's family members, whose safety had been the primary objective of his A-tier witness protection assignment. Agent Rebecca Martinez of the FBI's Witness Protection Task Force took charge of the operation, who were specialists in managing compromised protection cases and ensuring the safety of witnesses whose locations had been discovered or exposed. Marcus's cooperation with the federal response was immediate and complete, reflecting his understanding that his family's safety now depended on coordination with law enforcement agencies that had been protecting them. For 8 years, he provided access codes and security protocols that allowed federal agents to safely approach and enter the underground facility that had been his family's home since 2016. The storm cellar that every Nebraska farm required for tornado protection had been transformed into one of the most sophisticated safe houses in the federal witness protection program, containing living quarters, security systems, and communication equipment that had enabled a family of 5 to live safely underground while maintaining the appearance that only one person resided at the farmstead. Federal agents found Sarah Delacroix and her 3 children in living conditions that were comfortable and well-equipped despite their underground location. The facility included separate bedrooms, a fully equipped kitchen, educational areas where the children had completed their schooling, recreational spaces that had provided entertainment and exercise opportunities, and storage areas that contained supplies sufficient to support the family for months if external support became unavailable. Most impressive was the security and communication infrastructure that had allowed Marcus to coordinate with federal protection handlers while maintaining his cover identity as a bachelor farmer. The facility included encrypted communication systems, surveillance equipment that monitored approaches to the farmstead, and emergency protocols that could summon immediate federal response if the family's location was discovered by hostile parties. The installation was more sophisticated than most government safe houses. Agent Martinez would later tell congressional investigators, Marcus had created a facility that provided his family with safety, comfort, and normal family life despite their underground existence, while also maintaining operational security that had protected them for 8 years without any security breaches or exposure incidents. The discovery of Marcus's family and the revelation of their 8-year underground existence created immediate concerns about their continued safety and the long-term viability of their witness protection status. The Fontaine crime family's commitment to eliminating Marcus and his family had not diminished during the 8 years since his testimony, and their intelligence networks had continued searching for any indication of the family's location and circumstances. As federal agents secured the scene and began implementing procedures for relocating Marcus's family to a new secure location, the full scope of his extraordinary story began to emerge through interviews with family members and reviews of classified files that documented his witness protection assignment and the circumstances that had necessitated their underground existence. Marcus Antonio Delacroix had been one of the New Orleans Police Department's most effective organized crime investigators. With a career that included infiltrating criminal organizations, gathering evidence for federal prosecutions, and testifying in cases that had resulted in convictions of over 50 organized crime figures throughout Louisiana and the southeastern United States. His expertise in undercover operations and his understanding of criminal intelligence networks had made him invaluable to federal law enforcement agencies that were working to dismantle organized crime operations. The decision to testify against the Fontaine crime family had been the culmination of a 3-year investigation that had documented murder, drug trafficking, political corruption, and money laundering operations that generated hundreds of millions of dollars annually while maintaining influence over law enforcement, judicial, and political systems throughout Louisiana. Marcus's testimony had provided evidence that resulted in federal convictions of 12 high-ranking crime family members, including the organization's leadership structure. But the Fontaine family's response to Marcus's testimony had included threats against his wife and children that made continued residence in Louisiana impossible and necessitated entry into the federal witness protection program under circumstances that required extraordinary security measures. The family's intelligence networks had extensive connections throughout law enforcement and government agencies, making traditional witness protection methods insufficient for ensuring Marcus's family's safety. The decision to place Marcus's family in an underground facility while he maintained a cover identity as a bachelor. Farmer had been an innovative approach to witness protection that balanced safety requirements with the family's need for stability and normal development for their children. The operation had required Marcus to live a double life that tested his emotional strength and psychological resilience, while providing his family with security that had proven effective for 8 years. Detective Delacroix's testimony was directly responsible for dismantling one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in the southeastern United States. Agent Martinez explained to community members who had gathered to learn the truth about their neighbor's identity. His family's safety required extraordinary protection measures, and his success in maintaining their security while building a productive life in your community represents one of the most effective witness protection operations in federal law enforcement history. The revelation that Marcus's agricultural success had been genuine added another layer of complexity to his story. While his cover identity as a farmer had been created to protect his family, his commitment to agricultural excellence and community service had been authentic expressions of his character and values. His farming operation had been profitable and innovative. His contributions to the community had been meaningful and appreciated, and his relationships with neighbors had been based on genuine respect and affection rather than simply operational requirements. The revelation of Marcus's true identity created complex emotions throughout Millbrook, the valley that reflected the community's struggle to reconcile their knowledge of Marcus the farmer with the reality of Detective Delacroix, the organized crime investigator and protected witness. Residents were amazed by the scope of his deception and impressed by his family's courage and sacrifice. But they were also moved by the realization that the man they had known and respected was exactly who they had believed him to be. Responsibilities and history that none of them could have imagined. Pete Peterson, who had become Marcus's closest friend and confidant in the community, struggled with mixed emotions about learning the truth. "I keep thinking about all our conversations over the years," Peterson told reporters who had descended on Millbrook Valley to cover the story. "Or Cass would ask me about the community, about people's problems and concerns, about changes that I thought were important. I thought he was just being a good neighbor, trying to understand the people around him. Now I realize he was also making sure that none of our local problems were being exploited by people who might want to hurt his family." The community's response reflected their understanding that Marcus's deception had been motivated by love, a necessity rather than criminal intent or malicious purposes. His 8 years of genuine contribution to the agricultural community, his assistance during emergencies, and his respectful treatment of neighbors had earned him loyalty and affection that survived the revelation of his true identity and circumstances. Jim Kowalski, whose parents had been saved by Marcus's emergency response leadership expressed gratitude that transcended the shock of learning about his neighbor's secret life. Marcus risked exposing his family's location to save my parents' lives, Kowalski explained to media representatives. He could have stayed silent and protected his operational security, but he chose to help people who needed him. Even though it meant sacrificing 8 years of successful hiding to save neighbors who had no idea they were being protected by someone extraordinary. Chief Deputy Walsh found himself at the center of media attention as reporters sought to understand how a federal witness protection operation had been conducted successfully in their jurisdiction for 8 years without local law enforcement detecting the deception. Walsh's response reflected both professional embarrassment and personal admiration for Marcus's operational security and community integration. Detective Delacroix wasn't undermining local law enforcement, he was making it more effective by handling security threats that we never would have recognized, Walsh explained to CNN correspondents. His presence in our community provided protection against organized crime activities that could have affected our entire region. And his assistance during emergencies demonstrated the kind of leadership and expertise that made our community safer and stronger. The exposure of Marcus's operation created significant challenges for federal witness protection planners who had to rapidly develop new security arrangements for the Delacroix family while managing the publicity implications of having one of Delacroix. Their most successful operations exposed through accidental circumstances. Congressional oversight committees demanded briefings on witness protection procedures and effectiveness, while law enforcement agencies worked to ensure that other protected witnesses would not be compromised by the revelation of Marcus's story. But the exposure also provided an opportunity to demonstrate the human side of witness protection operations and the extraordinary sacrifices that families make when they choose to cooperate with law enforcement efforts to combat organized crime. Marcus's story illustrated the personal costs of standing up for justice, while also showing how ordinary communities can unknowingly support and protect people who are serving the greater good at tremendous personal risk. 6 months after the storm that changed everything, Millbrook Valley had been transformed from an obscure Nebraska farming community into a symbol of the hidden heroism and quiet sacrifice that protect American communities from threats that most citizens never realize exist. The Delacroix family had been relocated to a new secure location, but their 8 years in the valley had left lasting impacts that continued to influence the community's understanding of service, sacrifice, and the importance of protecting people who choose to stand up for justice. The farmstead where Marcus had conducted his double life had been preserved as a memorial and educational facility, with the underground safe house converted into a museum that provided public education about witness protection operations while protecting classified details of ongoing cases. The facility attracted visitors from throughout the country who came to understand how ordinary communities can harbor extraordinary people and how the greatest service often requires the greatest personal sacrifice. Emma, Michael, and Sophie Delacroix had been provided with new identities and educational opportunities that would allow them to pursue their dreams while maintaining the security that their father's testimony had made necessary. Their 8 years of underground education had prepared them for academic and professional success that honored their mother's teaching and their father's commitment to justice, while their experience with sacrifice and service had shaped their character in ways that would influence their contributions to society throughout their lives. The Marcus Delacroix Foundation, established with donations from law enforcement organizations and citizen supporters throughout the country, has provided financial assistance for families of law enforcement officers who had been threatened or targeted because of their service, while also supporting community development projects in rural areas that faced economic challenges similar to those that had affected Millbrook Valley. Detective Delacroix demonstrated that protecting America requires more than investigating crimes and arresting criminals, Foundation's mission statement declared. It requires people who are willing to sacrifice their own safety and freedom to ensure that justice prevails and that criminal organizations cannot intimidate communities into accepting corruption and violence as inevitable parts of life. The storm cellar that had concealed one of America's most successful witness protection operations became a symbol of the hidden depths that exist beneath the surface of ordinary American life. Tour groups would stand in the underground facility, where a family had lived for 8 years while the father conducted agricultural work that provided genuine community service while maintaining perfect operational security, marveling at the complexity of the operation and the strength of the family bonds that had made such sacrifice possible. But for the people of Millbrook Valley, the most important legacy was their understanding that heroism often wears work clothes, that the greatest service requires no audience, and that protecting the innocent is a calling that can transform ordinary people into extraordinary guardians of justice and freedom. Marcus had proven that you don't need a badge or uniform to serve your community, that the most important battles are often fought in the most ordinary places, and that love not duty is the source of the greatest courage and the most meaningful sacrifice. As Pete Peterson would tell visitors who came to understand Marcus's story, he was exactly who we thought he was, a hardworking farmer, a good neighbor, and someone who made our community better by being part of it. The fact that he was also a decorated police detective protecting his family from organized crime just made him more of who he already was, not someone different. Heroes don't become less real when you discover they're even more heroic than you imagined. The contents of that storm cellar had revealed the most extraordinary story in Millbrook Valley's history. But they had also confirmed the most ordinary truth that Marcus Thompson had been exactly the person his neighbors had known and respected, just with responsibilities and courage that none of them had been able to imagine. His legacy would live on in the children he had protected, the community he had served, and the nation he had helped keep safe through a dedication that required no recognition and sought no reward beyond the knowledge that his sacrifice had made the world safer for the people he loved most. In the end, Marcus's story became a reminder that heroism is often invisible, that sacrifice is most meaningful when it goes unnoticed, and that the greatest service to community and country is often indistinguishable from the greatest love for family. The man who had been exposed during a rescue operation while trying to save neighbors from floodwaters had actually lived as he had farm serving something greater than himself, while never forgetting that love, not duty, was the source of his strength and the measure of his success. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.